Good, okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breakfast and Learn. I'm terribly sorry for the technical hitch here. I have to update my app on my computer. So we're delighted to have Rabbi Bennett with us this morning. Without further ado, Rabbi Bennett will address us, I'm sure.
Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to address a question in Halacha, which is based on the Gemara in Moed Katan, which I think is very apt for this time of year. We're in a kind of funny period of time where Tisha B'Av is, still in the recent memory, and Tisha B'Av is a very full-on experience in terms of the experiential observances of Tisha B'Av. We physically, not alongside the fasting, there's the build-up of the 3 weeks and the 9 days until eventually we get to the point of Tisha B'Av, and then we're sitting on the floor in a state of Avelis, over the Churban Beis Hamikdash, the destruction of the temple. And then we have this very, very strange shift of gears. If we know we get into a Chatzos, we get until midday of the next day following Tisha B'Av, where some of the morning's experiences are lifted. But I still have a memory of being in Israel 1 year in yeshiva. At that minute, when it got to halachic midday, and in yeshiva at that point, it was sort of like someone had turned on the taps of, sort of all the energy and release of sort of the tension and build-up of all of the 3 weeks was kind of at that point. And everywhere I looked in the dorms in yeshiva, there was people suddenly, shaving off their beards, and there was someone jumping in the shower, and this person running down to the washing machine. And then there was my American friend, who, of course, being typically American, had got his grill set up, and he was ready to have his first barbecue that he'd been waiting for since before the 9 days. But we have this strange thing of, Tisha B'Av is so meaningful, yet most of us too tend to think about, well, that's it, summer holidays. And as we can see, the shul was slightly sparser in terms of attendance this morning, with many people clearly on summer holidays. But we have this moment of intense mourning, but yet we seem to kind of just go back to it. So I wanted to address a question of halacha that might perhaps help us take some of that clarity, that feeling, that connection that we have on Tisha B'Av with us into the year, which is a practical question in halacha. So Masechtas Moed Katan deals with two topics primarily. First of all, being the laws of Chol HaMoed, but it also is the source in the Talmud of the laws of Avelis, of mourning, Lo Aleinu. And within that, it mentions the following halacha, and it says, and this is on Chaf Vav and Aleph in Moed Katan, Ve'elu korin she'ein misachin. These are the instances where a person would have to tear kriya, would have to tear their clothing as a sign of mourning, which then shouldn't be repaired afterwards. So what are they? Hakoir al aviv al imoy, someone who tears on the instance of losing a parent. Al Rabbi shilum the Torah, on his rabbi who's taught him Torah. Al nasi al abbeistin, or the particular leaders of the generation in terms of Torah Torah leadership. Al shemur hara'as, on hearing bad news. Al bilkas Hashem, which is the Gemara putting it in the opposite terms. Birkas Hashem, it literally means blessing God's name, but it's hearing someone cursing the name of God. If someone would hear such an instance, then you would need to tear kriya. I'll say for Torah shenisraf, on hearing or witnessing a Sefer Torah that had been burnt. Al Ira Yehuda al Mikdash al Yerushalayim, and on the cities of Yehuda, on the Beis Hamikdash and on Yerushalayim, Koira al Mikdash or Mosef al Yerushalayim, and then one should tear kriya over the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the destruction of Yerushalayim. So this is brought in the Gemara, this idea of tearing kriya over the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Just like one, in many ways, the halachas are exactly parallel, tears kriya over losing a relative, there is this idea of tearing kriya over Yerushalayim. And the Gemara wants to know, where is the scriptural source for this idea of tearing kriya? And these sources will be important because we learn halachas from them. So the Gemara says further down the Amids, Ari Yehuda Minan. How do we know that for cities of Judah we would tear kriya? And we're talking about that these cities are in destruction. Okay, and the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Sefer Yirmiyah, and this is dealing with in the middle of the episode of the fast we observe on the day after Rosh Hashanah, being Tzom Gedalia. Gedalia was the leader of the Jewish people, was left in position after the destruction of the temple, and there was the hope that as long as he remained in position, there was a hope that the Jewish people may return from exile and rebuild Jerusalem. But as we know, he was assassinated. Okay, he was assassinated, and that's what we that final piece of the destruction we remember on Tzom Gedalia. And the Gemara quotes the pasuk, "V'yavar anashim mishchem u'mishiloi." these men came from the cities of Shechem and Shchilo, the Shomim and the Shomron and the Shomron, Shmoinim Ish, there was 80 of them, Megolche Zakein, they'd shaved off their beards, the Koire Bigdehem, and they torn their clothing. Okay, and they were coming, the Gemara says, and they brought offerings with them as they were planning to go to the Beis Hamikdash and bring offerings. And they hear along the way that in fact the Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed, and therefore they've shorn off their beards as a sign of mourning, and they've torn their clothing as a sign of mourning over the destruction. So this is the Gemara. Now we have many instances in the Gemara of things being mentioned, but they're not always codified in halacha. But this idea very much is. It's found in the Rambam, it's found in the Torah and the Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah all quote this Gemara as halacha, bisman hazeh, as halachic, certainly in their times, that one should do them. So let's just quickly read through the words of the Torah, who says, Haroye ira Yisrael, and I'm going to say immediately that although he mentions cities of Israel, the poskim say that it's actually not specific in that, and it means the cities of Yehuda, so particularly the cities of Judah. Haroye ira Yisrael b'chorban, and anyone who sees the cities of Israel in their destruction, and there's a series of psukim that when a person witnesses these cities in destruction, there are psukim that are quoted that mention the destruction of them. You don't need to tear for each city, as long as you've torn kriya for the first city you've seen in its destruction, then you don't need to tear anymore. Because Shira Yerushalayim, if a person is traveling through Israel and gets to Yerushalayim, he should say the following pasuk: Omer Tzion Midbar Haisa Yerushalayim Shema Shemema. That the city of Jerusalem has become a desert, it's become vacant, and it's become empty. The Koira, and he should then tear kriya, because Shirei Beis HaMikdash, when he sees the Beis HaMikdash, and we usually say the absence of the Beis HaMikdash, Omer Beis Kadshenu Tifatenu Asher Halalucha Abeisenu Hayesreifas Eish. He should say the following: the house, or the holy house of our glory, which our fathers would praise there, has been burnt in fire. Machmadea, and all of the things that we treasured about the city has been left for destruction. Okay.
5 more hostages.
Okay, so we can see this idea of being tearing kriya, and this is brought out. Now the question is, there's many specific details that I want to try and address in sort of the next 10 minutes of how exactly does this halacha apply of tearing kriya for the destruction of the temple in our times. One question we can ask is, well, what exactly is called destruction? And how does that apply in 2024 when we have a modern day state of Israel? We have, since 1967, we have a united Jerusalem. Does this halakha apply today? And the halakha about actually tearing kriya at the Kaisel, at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, or is that considered being their witness to seeing the destruction of the temple? Is seeing the mosque on top of the Temple Mount, would that be a cause to tear kriya? And we're also going to look at a couple of reasons why there may be many people that are not particular in observing this halacha, even though, as I said, it is definitely brought down in the Rambam, in the Torah, in the Shulchan Aruch, and in the Mishnah Berurah, obviously these ideas. So let's deal with that first question about what exactly is called destruction. There's 2 ideas brought in the Beis Yosef about what is considered a city of Yehuda in Chorbanim, in its destruction. The first most obvious example that the Beis Yosef gives this explanation is a city which has been emptied of its Jewish population. It was Beitar as a city, we know, is a modern city which has been rebuilt on the same name of the ancient city, but we know Beitar was a city which was filled with millions of Jewish people that were then wiped out, destroyed, and the Jewish population was sent into exile. So that is one suggestion that Beis Yosef brings. However, he brings another one that actually he says is the proper halachic understanding. The Bach agrees with him on this, is even if you still have a Jewish population living in that city, but the Jews themselves are not in control of that city, they are tachas umos, they are subjugated by other nations living there, then that would be considered a city of Israel in destruction. So fascinating, we know Israel, obviously throughout the years, called by many different names throughout history, and the archaeologists say that Jerusalem as a city is quite unique in the fact that each layer of the city that they excavate, as you can see the different civilizations, different empires that ruled over the city of Jerusalem, one burnt underneath the other and destroyed underneath the other until you have the ruins there of them remaining. But certainly that understanding, if you have a city of Israel which has been not only emptied of its Jewish population, but there are still Jews living there, but they are not in control of the city, they're subject to a foreign rulership, that would be considered Israel in its Churban, in its state of destruction. That's certainly how the Beis Yosef, that's how the Mishnah Berurah and the Bach rule on this, which raises a question for us today. With a modern day state of Israel, is perhaps this halacha no longer applies. If the understanding of Israel in its Churban and Yerushalayim in its Churban, it means that there are non-Jews ruling over us in there, perhaps we don't have to tear Kriya when visiting these cities today. So Rav Moshe Feinstein certainly actually brings and mentions that idea and says, someone who's traveling to Israel, and although we've not yet been redeemed, we don't yet have Mashiach yet, he says one would not need to tear Kriya overseeing the city of Jerusalem, because he says with the kindness of Hashem, it has been rebuilt and united under Jewish leadership of the Israeli government and the modern day state of Israel. So one would not need to tear Kriya. Now we're going to see not everyone agrees with Moshe Feinstein on that, but that's certainly an interesting halakhic opinion to note that one would not need to tear Kriya. He does say though that definitely when seeing the destruction of the temple, one still would need to tear Kriya. And remember, there was those three levels of tearing. There was this over the cities of Yehuda, the city of Yerushalayim, which is on an even higher level in terms of its specialness to the Jewish people, and then the actual site of the Beis HaMikdash. Rav Moshe says one certainly would need to tear Kriya for that. It's interesting to note, and I found these halakhic opinions absolutely fascinating, that there was dispute among the modern day poskim. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said that even though today that Yerushalayim, and we know Rav Shlomo Zalman lived in Yerushalayim his whole life, lived in was considered by many the one of the great rabbis of Jerusalem in the 20th century. He says that, and I'll read his words out. The Kozman Sharom Adain Be'ir HaKodesh, the whole time that we still see in our holy city, the Hamikdash and the site of the sanctuary, the Beis HaMikdash itself, Knesio Shel Nachrim, then Kavrei Akum, he says, whilst we see non-Jewish places of worship built in the city of Jerusalem, that certainly would be a reason to tear Kriya. The fact that there are churches and other places where there's perhaps questions of idolatry within the city of Jerusalem itself, even though there is an Israeli government ruling over the city politically, the fact that there is still other places of worship within the city of Jerusalem, Rav Shlomo Zalman says that would still be a reason to tear Kriya of today. Even more interestingly, the stipler of Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky is quoted as saying the following, and I'm not going to get into a discussion on politics today, but it certainly is interesting what he mentions. He challenges this idea that Israel is actually in control of the cities of Jerusalem, independent, the city of Jerusalem and city of Israel independently. And he says the following. He quotes from someone else called Rav David Yun Grice, and he says, Va'anu lehem, you might recognize this following word even if your Hebrew is not very good. He answered them about this following question about should we tear Kriya in Jerusalem today? She'amerikayim sholtim. He says it's not the Israelis that are in charge. They may think they're in charge, but it's the Amerikayim. The Americans are in charge. And he says, Va'al pihem yishuk hakol, everything v'hichzik. Only with the American support, politically, economically, strategically, do the Israelis retain some kind of control over Jerusalem. Again, politically, I can understand people might totally disagree with this opinion, but that was his observation. And we can perhaps see in the past year how dependent that question, that relationship between Israel and America, and how fragile that's been. But he says the Israelis are not fully in control and are dependent on the American support to be able to maintain the status quo in Jerusalem. And therefore, he says there's no argument that actually one should not be tearing Kriya on the city of Jerusalem, and argues that one certainly should today. So we've seen three different opinions of Moshe Feinstein not tearing Kriya over the city of Jerusalem. Perhaps one does not need to do today because after post 67 of the recapture and reunification of Jerusalem, but the other halachic opinions of Shlomo Zalman and the stipler of Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, the one would need to, but everyone has agreed that seeing the Beis HaMikdash, seeing the absence of the temple, would be a reason to tear Kriya. Now, what exactly does one need to see when being at the site of the temple in order to tear kriya. Rav Moshe Sternbach perhaps gives us the first reason to be melamed zchus, to judge favorably those people that do visit the kosel and don't tear kriya. What is that? He argues that when the Gemara says, when witnessing the destruction of the temple, what exactly do you need to see? Now, we've got used to the fact when we talk about going to the site of the temple, we focus on a very, very small section of a perimeter wall. That's the kosel, that's become this iconic photo that we all take with our families and is used for bar mitzvahs and wedding celebrations and graduations from the army and various events. But we know that's not really the site of the temple at all. It's the site beyond that wall, which is really the important part. So Rav Moshe Sternbach argues that actually, in order to be witnessing the site of the destruction, it's not the outer wall that we're talking about. You need to be up higher and to see the floor of the Temple Mount. If you can see the floor of the Temple Mount and the absence of the temple, and certainly obviously the two mosques built either side of the Temple Mount, that would be cause to tear kriya. But if you're just standing by the kosel and you can't see over the wall, even by seeing the domes of the mosque, that would not be enough of a reason to tear kriya. And therefore he argues today, someone who's not visited the kotel for 30 days, he could go and daven there at the kosel. He wouldn't need to tear kriya. If he's not actually seeing the place of the sanctuary, which is the actual inside of the place, and he says but actually seeing the western wall itself, you wouldn't need to tear kriya. Now, again, there are those that disagree and certainly would say that seeing the Temple Mount as a site and seeing the kosel as another one would be reason to tear kriya, but Rav Moshe Sternbach does not. We'll finish with just a couple more questions as to why, particularly those that live in Jerusalem and may regularly go to visit the kosel, we don't see generally people coming back all the time from visiting the kosel with big. Why not? According to this, it's a halacha, and they should do. So, two things to understand. The Mishnah Berurah brings down that a child that has been born and raised in Jerusalem, it's a fascinating concept, has been born and raised in Jerusalem. When that child reaches bar or bat mitzvah, if they visited the kotel within 30 days of their bar or bat mitzvah, then they won't need to ever tear kriya. They won't ever need to tear kriya. Why is that? Because when they got to their bar or bat mitzvah, when they're now obligated to start tearing their clothing, they'd already visited the kotel within 30 days. And this halacha has a renewal of every 30 days. If you've visited the kosel and you've torn kriya, you've now got 30 days until you need to do it again. And if you go within those 30 days, you'll never have to tear kriya. As long as you go once every 30 days, you're okay. We're going to see that's important. Rosh Hashanah is something amazing to say about that idea. So a child that has visited before, he was technically or she was technically exempt before the bar or bat mitzvah, so will never actually have to tear kriya. That could be one suggestion, but we know not all of the children visiting were born in Yerushalayim. He says there's two other reasons. One is mentioned from the Klosenberger Rebbe, who, if we know a little bit about him, was the great hero of the community established in Netanya, built the Laniado Hospital, and a heroic figure of his work in re-establishing a community and support for those after the destruction of the Holocaust. He says a fascinating idea. He says this halacha of tearing kriya for the destruction of the cities of Israel, the city of Yerushalayim, and the Beis Hamikdash is certainly a din d'Rabbanan. It's a din from the rabbis. And we know there is a concept as mentioned in the Gemara when it comes to certain halachic obligations which are from the rabbis, not from the Torah. There is a concept if the community are not able to actually fulfill that obligation because of some external pressure, then that halacha may not apply. If you have a situation where the roiv had sibor, as mentioned in the Gemara, not everyone is able to actually keep up the halacha because it's too difficult, that halacha may not stick. Now, it's a very dangerous concept, and this concept was used incorrectly and falsely by the early Reform rabbis to say this is how mitzvahs became relative. It's too hard for people to keep Shabbos in the 20th century, so we don't have to do it. It's a total distortion of the Gemara. It's not what it means according to any of the Mefarshim. But if it's a din d'Rabbanan, I'll give you an example the Gemara mentions. We know, just like there was an idea of having supervised bread and supervised milk, the Gemara mentions also an idea of having supervised oil. Supervised oil. But the answer the Gemara says is it never stuck. It never stuck. It was too hard for people to get their olive oil or certain types of oil from a Jewish production. And therefore, the Tzibur said, we can't do this. It's too hard. So therefore, the Chacham said, okay, we won't enforce it. Says Rabbi Halberstam, says the Klosenberger Rebbe, he says, the level of poverty among many of the Jewish people, particularly in the early days of the state, telling people every time you go to the kotel to daven, you're going to have to tear a piece of your clothing every 30 days, is financially too difficult for people. People don't have that many spare clothes to be able to tear kriya with all the time. And therefore, he says that could be a reason why people are not particular with that halacha. I want to finish with, though, a thought of Rav Shlomo Zalman, which I think perhaps is the most apt thought that is mentioned. There's lots of fascinating questions with this. The Rav Rabinovitz, the Rav of the Kosel, actually asked a question about, what about if you've seen a picture of the Kosel on the internet? Does that count as having visited there every 30 days? Really interesting question. If a person's watched a live feed or seen a video of the Kosel, is that like actually halachically seeing it or not? Which is an interesting question. But however, the Rav Shlomo Zalman brings another reason as to why we see people are perhaps not particular about tearing kriya, which I think is a halachic answer, but it certainly gives us Muslim cause to stop and think. And he says the following: someone who lives in one of the neighborhoods in the suburbs of Jerusalem, even if it's one of the distant ones from the old city, could go in Beit Vegan. They live in Beit Vegan or Har Nof, Ramot, any of these modern neighborhoods which are outside the old city and in what we call the new part of Jerusalem. Really, halachically, as we've said, if that person goes to the old city and goes to daven at the Kosel, they should be tearing kriya. He doesn't live close enough to the Beis Hamikdash itself, to the site of it, and he's not been there for 30 days. So that person says, you know what, Shabbos afternoon, let's take a walk to the old city, let's go daven mincha in the Kosel, we'll go spend some time there. If it's on Shabbos and Yom Tov and Chol Hamoed, you wouldn't need to tear kriya, but if it was a weekday, you certainly would. Mikol Makim, says Rav Shlomo Zalman, minhag she'einu koreh. The minhag is you just don't see people doing it. He says, why is that? V'letam ha-minhag amar. He said, I could suggest a following reason as to why people are not particular with this minhag. The ko shadar ba'osa ha'ir. Anyone that lives in the city of Jerusalem, v'gam yachol b'kao lavoy l'sham, and it's easy for them to get there. So perhaps not someone who's very elderly or someone who's got difficulties with mobility, but someone that really has got no excuse not to having visited the Kosel within the last month. But for the last 30 days, he's not gone to visit the Kosel. Nikar she'enu margish karoi et sar hacharban. That becomes recognizable that this individual doesn't really feel the pain of the loss of the destruction of the temple. If they did, they would have visited it. But the fact they've not shows that doesn't really move them. And he says that must be the reason why people don't tear kriya. The halacha is, as an expression of the grief and the loss of the temple, one should tear kriya, but someone that's not gone to visit the Kosel at least every 30 days shows doesn't really move them, and therefore they wouldn't be obligated to tear kriya. And he says once he was asked, Hadar b'Yerushalayim v'lo haya shloshim yom b'Kosel maravi, and someone once said to him, someone that lives in Jerusalem has not been to the Kotel for 30 days. Al davazer atzmo roy lo likroy bigdo. He says that fact alone, for someone that lives in Jerusalem and has not visited the Kotel, Rav Shlomo Zalman suggested, maybe you should tear kriya for that. The fact that you have an opportunity that the Jewish people throughout millennia have yearned and desired and hoped to be able to go to daven in that site, and there's people that live in that city or they're just a bus ride away and don't bother to go, maybe that's something that we should be tearing kriya over. And that's why I was told, actually, that is where the idea of putting the notes in the Kotel wall comes from. We know this custom, we're putting the notes in the wall, you see there people going there. I can remember the furor caused by the yeshiva student who watched when Barack Obama, when he was a presidential candidate, had gone and put his note in the wall, and he went and found it afterwards and wanted to see what had he written. But where does the idea of coming from writing, in Yiddish word it's a kvittel, and writing and putting the note in the wall? So the idea I've told comes from the fact that if someone was going to travel to Jerusalem, then all the people in that town, in that shtibel, in that village, that person was a celebrity. You're going to Jerusalem, you're going to go daven at this place that we've heard and read so much about. I want you to take my prayer with you. And therefore the friends, the family, the concurrents would write their prayers on a piece of paper and say, take it with you to the wall. And then it ended up becoming this custom of putting the notes actually in the wall. The famous story is told of the end of the liberation of the old city in the battle in the 1967 Six-Day War, with that iconic photograph of those early soldiers with Rav Shlomo Goren, the rabbi of the IDF, blowing shofar at the site as a sign of the liberation there, at regaining access to the old city. And it's told that there was soldiers there that were in tears, understanding the huge significance of that moment of being able to regain access to that site and what it meant for the Jewish people. And at that moment, the people, I'm told, really believe this was the moment Mashiach must be here. I mean, the Jewish people are once again reuniting Jerusalem, and they're sounding the shofar, which was illegal under the British mandate to sound the shofar there at the site of the Kotel. And there were some of those soldiers that were moved to tears. And there was another group of soldiers that were in those initial battalions that were from secular kibbutzim that had come with much less religious education. And they noticed their comrades crying with emotion at the significance. And they also were moved to tears. And the one group of soldiers questioned the other and said, we understand why we're crying. It means so much to us. If you don't believe, you don't keep. Why are you crying? They said, we're crying because we don't know what you're crying about. We don't know what you're crying about. We can see it means so much to you, and we don't have that connection, that relationship. I think perhaps the most fitting way we can move through our summer towards an Elul and towards a Rosh Hashanah is taking those moments of Tisha B'Av with us by saying it could be, as Rav Shlomo Zalman said, the idea of not going to Jerusalem and seeing the Beis HaMikdash. That's something itself to take kriya on. So we've seen many reasons halachically one would be able to, and one should take kriya, but there are certainly opinions of not needing to. In today's time, everyone should ask their own questions. Rabbi Lister, I'm sure, will be happy to deal with them if one is planning to visit Jerusalem in the coming weeks. But certainly that message of feeling a connection and the loss of the temple is something we should take with us, not just on Tisha B'Av, but throughout the entire year. I will just mention as a final point, there is a famous shtick, I will call it, that is well known. I remember doing this as a teenager, which is in order to remove any doubts or questions when when arriving at the Kotel, in order to need to tear kriya, is to swap clothing with someone. Anyone ever heard of this idea?
Yeah.
Heard of this idea? So there's an idea, Rav Moshe Steinbach also deals with this question of making a kinyan on someone else's clothing. You'll think about when you go to sell your chametz with Rabbi Lister, he will have you pick up something as a sign of the acquisition. So the way it works is I would say to Rabbi Shisler, can I buy your clothing from you? And we'll lift something up as a sign of the acquisition. But you know what? You keep it on you and it will be a matana almanas lahachzir. It's a gift that I'll give you back later. Okay, and you can buy my clothing. That becomes then, I'm now a guardian on Rabbi Shisler's clothing, and he'd be a guardian on mine, and he would not be able to tear kriya. Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Moshe Sternbach says it's a very, very nice idea, but he doesn't advise one should rely on it. It doesn't work for all kinds of halachic reasons, and certainly would not be considered within the spirit of the idea. But it is something which certainly I've seen teenagers when going up to the Kotel on tour and things like that. They have tried that idea.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Very interesting. I'll actually be in Jerusalem this time next week. So I better
Got a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I pose the unanswerable $64,000 question? When would we be today if Moshe Dayan had not given the Har back to the one?
Yeah. I think
Probably you couldn't see what he's doing. He had one eye, didn't he?
Absolutely. I would say, as I could see on a few people's faces the Stipler's observation about the Americans being perhaps absolutely in charge, but I suspect that may have had something to do with the external pressure of what the world would have said if they'd have kept it in. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a fascinating question of what if they would have gone one step further at that point. Yeah.
When did he start to say it? Because it may be different now than it was when
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, Stipler certainly has not been alive for 25 years at least. So, let me see if there's a year on it. I don't know. It's certainly an interesting observation, though.
Anyway, thank you so much for that very interesting, very timely talk. Usual. Thanks for Karen for organising the breakfast. There will be a breakfast on over the next few weeks. I'm off for a couple of weeks, but they will be running in my absence. So there will be a breakfast alone and speakers on the news sheet. So morning, I'll just do the. You turn the recording on.